What's going on, guys? Welcome to Tectatious. My name is Sahaj, and today we're going to be talking about using Ngrx in Angular to manage state. So what does state management really mean? State management is mostly used to manage different states across your application. So your app could be in a different state based on different actions that are happening in your components. So it's crucial to manage that state, and having a framework such as Ngrx gives you a very powerful ability to manipulate that state as well as listen to changes on the state and perform certain side effects based on what the action that caused the state change is. So Ngrx is inspired by Rxjs and Redux. It uses Rxjs to mirror what Redux does for React or JavaScript based applications. So if you are familiar with Redux, then this should seem very straightforward to you. Of course, there's a certain format that's Angular specific for Ngrx, but that being said, we're going to be looking at setting up Ngrx today step by step and walking towards getting an initial understanding of how Ngrx works and how you can manage state in your Angular applications. So let's have a quick look at the diagram right here. So this is the Ngrx official documentation. I will link this in the description down below. But you can always go there. This is going to be a very powerful resource for you when you set up or maintain or use Ngrx. And that's what we're going to be doing in this tutorial as well. We're going to be referring to this documentation and building a small example with our state management and see how kind of that works out. Before we move ahead, I do want to request you to please like this video and subscribe to my channel if you like what I'm doing here and if you'd like to support me in bringing more content like this to you guys. So for this video, we're going to be looking at an Angular app that I have here. It's a very basic app. It's a marketplace where people can put up products for sale, just like a Facebook marketplace. And it has a header which has a sign-in page, and in the sign-in page, as you would expect, we have an email input field and a password input field. If I open the inspector here, and if I try and make my calls with any value here, you can see that it makes a call to my local API server that's running on Node. And of course, the email and password don't match, and hence the request is not a successful request, or it's not a successful response. But I can quickly just enter the correct credentials for a user that does exist, make a call, and we can see that we got a 200 because the email and password are correct here. Now, what we want to achieve from this video is that instead of making our API calls directly from the component, so this is the login component here, I have a sign in button clicked function, and as you can see, it's making a call within the function to log in, and then in here it subscribes to the response, and we can do additional stuff as we want, right? So we could maybe display an alert saying, hey, login successful, and you could also maybe send them to the homepage at a login successful. But what we're going to show today in the video is that how you can do all of this without polluting your component code. Your component does not need to care about what happens next in your app based on this action. All this component should care about is dispatching a login action, and everything else would be handled by the Ngrx store. So even once on a successful sign-in, we are on the home page, we no longer want to see the sign-in button. And using Ngrx and state management, we're going to update our authentication state within the Angular app, and we're going to see how this header will change based on the updated state, and it will no longer show the sign-in button, but instead it will show the user information to indicate that the user has logged in. So looking at this diagram, we can see that there's 5 major pieces to the Ngrx store. One is the store itself, where the state is saved. Uh, then we have something called as a reducer. Reducer is a pure function that takes in the previous state, and it takes in the kind of action that caused that reducer to update the state, and then it has its own logic to update the state as needed based on the action that was dispatched. Then we have the third component, or the third piece, called action itself. Action is, as the name describes, an action taking place in your component or a service that based on which you want your state to be updated. So for example, if we're making the login state management in the Angular app, successful login would be an action that we can dispatch and let the store know that, hey, this is an action that I am dispatching, and I want you to listen to the state to this action dispatch and update my state as needed. So in the login scenario, the store or the reducer might update the state with the new user information that came back from the successful login. It might also update the state with the let's say JWT token, if that's the security schema that we're using. So that way we'll have a new state, and it would be stored in the store itself. And now this store is going to be application wide. That means that any component or any service throughout the application will be able to access this particular state from the store. So if we look at the left side of this diagram here, we can see that the component has a selector defined. It can listen to the selector. Now, what is a selector? Selector is a method you can define in your store to return certain piece of your state. So for example, if my authentication state has a user and also a token and some other information, right? And I, as a component, am only interested in just a token from that state. So I can create a selector to return just the current token in the state, and my component can be listening to that selector, and basically every time that state is changed, it would always have access to the latest token. Using that information, we'll be able to do a lot of nicer things in our UI. For example, if you have a header in your app with a sign-in button, then you can update your header to no longer display the sign-in button and instead display some user information indicating that the user has logged in. And all of this can be taken care of by your Ngrx boilerplate code and the logic that you put in there. So your Ngrx store is the one that's responsible for taking care of all of that. And all your components need to do is either dispatch an action saying, hey, something has happened, do whatever you need to do. And the other thing that your components that need to do is basically just listen to the new updated state, and that is it. They don't care about anything else. So for example, if you have API calls that you need to make, or you have other UI changes or UX changes that you need to do in your app, your components can only have their own individual responsibilities. They don't need to care about all these things. So that makes it very easy to scale your code. When your project becomes bigger and bigger, it's better to have your components smaller and just doing one thing or one responsibility, and having this logic separated and maintained only by the store is really powerful. And we're going to see that in the example that we use for our tutorial today. So the fifth piece that I want to talk about is effects. So whenever an action is dispatched, we can have an effect defined that will listen to the action dispatch and do something. It can do anything. It can basically, for example, if you have an API call that you need to make, right? For example, you have a login successful action, right? You got a login done. And now at that point, you want that I also need to fetch my users' favorite products. So if we're building a marketplace and a user can have a favorite products list, then whenever I log in, I want to fetch and update my state with my user's favorite products. So instead of having to write that code in our component to listen to when a login has been done and then make that call to update the state for the favorite products of the user, we can use an effect that will automatically get triggered when the login successful action has been dispatched. So this is mostly used for API calls. There's also other scenarios that you can use them in, but most common use of them, of effects, is making your API calls based on your action dispatches. So even for a login request, you can literally just dispatch a login request action from your login component, and you can have an effect defined which will listen to this action and make the API call. So your API call never needs to be in your components anymore. So that's the brief of how Ngrx works and what these major 5 pieces are. And next up, we can finally start looking at the code and see how we can set it up, and also work with this login example that I just talked about and see how that helps us scale our apps and keeps our components and services way cleaner. So let's start looking at how we can actually get started with setting up Ngrx. We can go to the walkthrough here, and we can see that there's a bunch of stuff already defined here in their documentation that explains how actions can be created, how reducers can be created, and how we can import the store in our app itself. So before we do that, we do need to go and install our Ngrx itself. So to do that, we can go to the installation here, and if you're using npm, you can run this script in your project. I personally am using yarn, and hence I will go to my project and I will run that script. So this is my project structure here, and I am using a monorepo using NX or Narvel, and this is the root of my monorepo, and hence I'm gonna run the command right here. So the command is yarn add ngrx/store. Okay, so that's gonna install a bunch of dependencies, and once that is done, we should be able to start using the Ngrx store in our codebase. And there we go. And before we move ahead, I also do want to install Ngrx effects because we are going to be demonstrating those as well. So again, for npm, you can use this. For yarn, I'm going to use this. You can also use Angular CLI using this ng-add command. But today for the demo, I'm going to be using yarn. Let's go ahead and paste that here. And let's get Ngrx effects installed in our code base. And while that's being done, we can go back to our Ngrx store doc walkthrough section, and we can start writing our first action. So as I mentioned before, just to give you a quick overview again, in the Angular app, we have source, app, and then in here I have my pages, and I have a login page. Right now, the login page on the login button click is actually making the API call manually and doing all the logic that it needs to do in the subscription of that call. So what we're going to do is we're going to add our first state, which is going to be the authentication state, which is going to hold or manage all the state that's relevant to a user's authentication. So if the user is logged in or not, if the user is logged in, then also holding the information about the user itself. So to do that, we can go, the first thing we need to do is go to our app module, and we need to import the store module in our app module itself. So let's go and do that. Go to app module, and in here in the imports we can add store module, and this should be coming from Ngrx store. Oops, go back here, and we can literally copy this. And now that we have that, we've imported store module from Ngrx store, and we can leave this import as is for now. The next thing we want to do is we want to create a directory for holding our app-wide state. So for the way I like to do that is create a folder called state in my app folder, and then in the state itself I like to create folders specific to the state that I'm handling. So it could be an auth state. You could have multiple states here, but today we're going to be doing the auth state. So I'm going to create a folder called auth inside of state, and in the auth folder I need 3 files. I need auth.actions.ts, I need auth.reducer.ts. Actually, I'm going to rename this to auth.reducer, and we need auth.effects.ts. So now that we have that, we can go and look at how Angular documentation or Ngrx documentation defines its actions. So we can literally just copy this here, and let's see. So we can start by importing create action. We can do this import from the Ngrx store itself. So just copy that. All right, and in here we have, so the first action I want to have for my login, I want to have 3 actions. I want to have a login request action, and the format, the way we define these actions, the first parameter in this create action from Ngrx store should be a type of the action. So in here in the square brackets, I'm going to say that this is relevant to my auth state, and the action itself is a login request. And then the other parameter is the properties. This is basically the properties that we want to send with this action. So whenever a component or a service needs to dispatch this action, they can send these parameters. So a login request action would typically have email and password, right? Because a login request action without these things is meaningless. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to make a credentials object, and in here I'm going to say it can have an email and it can have a password, and that's it. This is our first action. Now I'm going to copy and paste this here 3 times. We're going to change the second one to be login success, change this here to login success, and this action is going to be dispatched when a login was successful. So if you call an API and you get a successful response, at that time you can dispatch this action to update the state as needed. So and for the properties in here, we want to pass the successful response. So if you're wondering where I got my auth login response imported from, this is from my OpenAPI package, and this is basically using OpenAPI's code generation tool to auto-generate my Angular client libraries. I have a video on that if you want to see how you can use those the power of code gen and OpenAPI to leverage that in your Angular apps and not have to write or maintain any of your API code. So I'll link that to this video. Definitely check it out. And then coming back here, we have a login success action and a login failure action. And then in login success, we already defined the success response as the payload, and in the login failure, we define a string which is going to be an error. So this failure is going to be triggered when there's a failure response from the login API. We're going to dispatch that ourselves. So now let's look at the reducer. In the reducer, first thing we want to do is define the state of authentication. So our authentication state can have a token. Again, this is based on the way I have my authentication set up for my project, which is JWT based. And then you can have the user of type user. Again, I import this from my OpenAPI library. And then I have login error. And this can be a string, right? So this error would be populated when the login failure action is dispatched. And then next thing we want to do is define or declare an initial state, which is going to be of type state that we defined right above. And then we're just going to say that it's null by default. The token is null, user is null. And now let's actually create our reducer. So to do that, we can use create reducer from Ngrx store. I'm going to import that here. And then within create reducer, first thing you want to say is the initial state, which we defined right above. And then it also takes in a on function as a parameter. Again, this is imported from Ngrx store. And the first argument to this is actually the action that you want to listen to and then update the state accordingly. So in this case, you want to listen to the login success action. We get that imported from auth actions. And then as the second argument, you pass a callback, which has the previous state, and then it has the payload that was attached with the login success dispatch, which was our login success response. And then in the callback body, we simply return the new state. So we want to say get my old state and then merge that with the updated token, which is going to be in our success response. And we also want to update our user object, which is going to be in our success response.user object. And that is it. That should define our reducer to handle the login success dispatch. And then we can do something similar for our login failure action. So let's rename this to login failure. And login failure's payload is actually an error, so we can change that. And we also need to import the login failure action from auth actions. And then we simply return a new state, which will have login error to be the error that was sent as payload of the login failure action dispatch. And then this token, we want to set it to null just in case, as well as the user. So this will basically help with logging him out from the app. Then once you do that, the last thing we want to do here is actually export the reducer function like this, and then simply return the function that we described or defined above. And that's it. We have our reducer defined. And once we have our reducer defined, we can go to our app module file. In the app module file, for store module, we want to say for root, and then we can pass in the reducers, which is the states for our app that the store needs to contain and keep track of. So in here we say our store or state is going to be auth, and then we pass in the reducer that's going to take care of all the actions for that state. So for that, we can import auth reducer from auth.reducer. And that is it. And now if we go back to the login component, right now we have this API call being done manually on login button click. I'm going to comment that out, and I'm going to inject our Ngrx store in here. And going to import that from Ngrx store. And now when my sign in button is dispatched, what I really want to do is say that, hey, my store, go ahead and dispatch an action, which is going to be the login request action, because I'm requesting a login. So auth actions. Now we need to import our auth actions. So general convention to do that is to say import all as auth actions from and the actual actions, auth actions. And now in the dispatch, we can literally just go and say auth actions dot login request, and within there we can pass in our credentials. So let's define our credentials here. Credentials have email, which is user.email that we get from our input form, and password, which will be user.password. And in our dispatch login request payload, we're going to send the credentials, and that is it. This should go ahead and dispatch the login request action, and it should go to our auth reducer and look at the reducer for login success action, and it should update the state as needed. So right now our login success, so if we so this actually would look at the login request. So we have no reducer here for login request because we don't really need one. The state does not change when a login is requested, unless you had something called a is login in progress, right? And it could be a boolean. And then you could have a login request reducer here, which would basically set that to true. And that would help you if you want to display a spinner or something when you have your login request going. But for this video, we will not go into that. We'll simply display how we dispatch the action from our login component here. And right now, login request action is dispatched, but nothing's really happening. So this is where things get interesting. What we could do is that we can create an Ngrx effect that would listen to this login request action, and then whenever this action is dispatched with these credentials, it would actually go ahead and make the API call, and based on the response that it gets back, it will dispatch the login success action. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go to our auth.effects. I have these effects defined here, but I'm going to simply walk you guys through them. So this is an injectable auth effects class, and then in here, let's look at let's comment this out for now, and let's look at our first effect here. So this is called a login request effect, and we use create effect from Ngrx effects package. And to understand this, you need to be fond of using Rxjs. If you're not, I recommend that you research a bit about how Rxjs works and how you can use it with observables and all, and then you should have a better understanding of what really happens when we do these pipes and when we use these off type or exhaust map kinds of operators from Rxjs. But essentially what's happening here is we're creating a new effect. We're saying that this effect is associated with login request action. So whenever login request action is dispatched, so if I open the login component here, we can see that on sign in button click, we dispatched the login action, login request action. And now we're saying that whenever login request action is dispatched, this effect should be run. And then we do an exhaust map, and then inside there we actually do our API call. So auth service is what I have from OpenAPI that does my actual HTTP call, and it sends in the parameters. So notice how it gets the email and the password credentials from the action object. So login request had a payload, which was the credentials, as we can see right here on the right side, and on the left side here now in the login, we're able to access the payload there, and then send that to our login endpoint. And then we do another pipe there to get the response from our login API call. And then in there, when we get a successful response, we dispatch a new action, which is the login success action. And we pass in the payload as the response that came back to us from our API. And then if there was an error with the login, then we catch that error and we dispatch a login failure action with the error that came back from the API. And notice that when you're in the catch error block, you need to return a new observable of the action dispatch call. But that pretty much covers how you create an effect and how you can leverage that to do what you need to do from your component side of things. So now if we run this code, go to our Angular app, it's going to refresh, go to sign in page, and if I hit sign in here, nothing happens. Why does nothing happen? That is because we have our effects here, but we never defined them. We never actually imported them in our app module, so they're never active. What we need to do is we need to go to our app.module file. In here, we want to import effects module from Ngrx effects package. So again, if you didn't do that in the beginning, you can still just use npm or yarn to install this package. And then you want to say effects module dot for root. And in here, you want to pass an array that can hold all your effect classes. So you can have multiple effect classes. Right now, we only have auth effects. We're going to pass in auth effects. We import that from our auth.effects file. And that is it. And now if I save it, go back to the application, refresh it, hit sign in. And in my network tab, I can see that a call was actually made and my parameters were sent and I got a 200 back. And we can just type in some random stuff here just to make sure that our payload is sent correctly. Hit sign in, and we had a failed response because the user does not exist. And we can see that the payload was sent correctly. So you can see how easier it got for our components to make API calls and do all the additional stuff that needs to be done without having to write a lot of code in there or even to maintain it. So all our sign in button really is doing is simply dispatching the login request action. And then everything else is taken care of by the effects and as well as the actions and the reducers. So when a login success action is dispatched, the reducer is able to update the new state, update the previous state with the new token and the new user that's sent in the login success payload. And that explains how we're able to leverage effects and actions and reducers to make state management work for us and keep our components cleaner and shorter. Now, for better UX, what I want to do here is that when I click on sign in, and if it's a successful sign in, I want to display an alert and I want to send the user to the home page. Now, you might think that we can do that in the component here itself, right? We can display an alert here, login successful, but we don't even know if the login was successful here. We're not listening to that event. So we could listen to it, but the ideal situation here is to leverage your side effects in Ngrx. So if we go to auth effects, and if we create a new effect here, I'm going to uncomment this, and we are calling it login success effect, and this effect is concerned with the login success action. So whenever login success action is dispatched, login success effect will take place, and then inside of it we're simply just getting the payload of this login success, so whatever payload was sent. In this case it was the actual success response, and then inside the tab body we're simply routing them to the home page, and then we're also displaying an alert login successful, welcome, and then we're using the response that came back in the login success dispatch, and we're using that to display the logged in user's first name. So notice that when we had a login request effect, we made our API call, and then if the API call was successful, we actually dispatched the login success action, and in the payload we passed in the response that came back. And then that's the response that's being used here in the login success effect with login success response, and we're using that to display the user's first name. One thing to notice here is that we send a second argument here to create effect, which is dispatch false. This basically means that this effect is not dispatching a new action. So this is very important, otherwise you're gonna have a code that's stuck, you're gonna have memory leak, and your code is basically going to be waiting for an action to be dispatched from you. So make sure you set this to dispatch false, because we're not actually dispatching an action here. And now if we save that and go back to our app, click sign in, and voila, we have a alert box that shows the name of the user. And if we click OK, we also get back to the home page. So see how we do all of those things by just simply dispatching this one login request action in the component. So our component is so short right now. We don't need all those injections. All we need is the input form, and we need to dispatch the login request action, and that is it. Everything is taken care of for us from that point on. Now, one thing I wanna show for the sake of UX and for the sake of understanding how selectors work. See how we have a header here and we have the sign in button here. So we just logged in, but we still see the sign in button there, right? And we don't want to show the sign in button if the user is logged in. Instead, what I want to show is a button with maybe the username and a user picture, maybe a menu with my account, my settings, and whatnot. We're not going to get too fancy with this video. All I'm going to do for this video is update the header component to listen to the state of authentication and hide the sign-in button, and instead show a button that reads the name of the user to indicate that the user is logged in and that the state management is working as expected. To do that, we're going to go to the auth.reducer file, and we're going to create selector here from Ngrx, which is going to allow us to pick up the auth state and pick up certain pieces of the auth state and use them in our components to do anything that they need with their UI or any kind of logic. So let's go ahead and create a selector. So first we need a selector to actually select this auth state from the global app state. So this auth is a feature. If we go back to app module and look at store module.forRoot, in here we can see that we define auth as the key of this particular state, right? And then when we're creating the selector for this particular auth state, we can use that key to get that state. So we can say select auth state equals create feature selector. We get this from Ngrx, and then the feature selector is going to be of type state, which is the state we define here for our auth, and then in here we put the name of the key for our state, which we defined in the app.module file. So once you do that, you have access to your auth feature, and now you can make custom selectors to select specific pieces of the state. So for example, if I only care about the token or only care about the user, I can simply use those selectors to get that information in my components. So let's create one for a token, and we're going to use create selector this time, again from Ngrx, and the first argument we pass to it is to select our auth state, and then the next argument we get the state, from the previously called select auth state, and then we use that state to return the token in that state. So that's how we create a selector for the token. We can also create a selector for user and return the user. So to summarize, we select the auth state from the global app state first, and then we use the create selector to basically select certain pieces of the auth state. Now that we have this in place, we can head back to the header component. And in the header component, if we look at the template, we have these buttons here, and one of the buttons is a sign in button. And what we want to do is somehow put an if condition here saying that if my user has a token, a valid token, then you can stop showing this and instead show a new button that would display the name of the user. So let's see how we can do that. First thing we want to do is inject the Ngrx store, and this is going to be of type auth state because that's the state we care about. To do that, we can import all as from auth, and we can just import that from state auth and auth.reducer. So we're basically importing everything from auth reducer file, and we're calling it from auth. That's an alias. Again, that's an Ngrx way of importing things from your reducers. So now we can say that the store is going to be of type auth state. So from auth.state. Next thing we need is the JWT token, right? This is going to be an observable, and we can select it from our store now. And as a selector, we can pass in the selector that we created. So from auth.select token. So if I open my reducer file here on the right, this is the selector we created, and in here I simply pass in that selector. I can also get my user in a similar fashion, say from auth.select user. Now I'm getting these separately, but I could have also just got the entire state, but it's usually ideal to get only what you need because there could be other things in the auth state that your header component doesn't necessarily care about. So in this case, I'm going to be having these two observables here, and now that we have this in place, all we need to do is go to the template file. In the template file's sign in button, I'm going to add a ngIf condition, and I'm going to say that display this only if the token is null, right? So let's do that by saying not JWT token, and we are going to use Angular's async pipe to get the response from the observable, the actual data, and use that as an ngIf condition. And now that we have this in place, we can also add another button to the very end of our header. So this is going to be the very right side. And now in the ngIf, we want to say that if token does exist, right? So I'm going to remove the exclamation mark, and if it does exist, then show this button. The title of the button should be so I want to show the user's first name. So we have the user observable here. User, again, use the async pipe to get the data of the user, and then we're going to say first name. And we can remove this click for now and save this, and let's see what we did. So just give it a refresh, sign in, login successful, welcome John, and voila, look at our header. Our sign in button has gone, and now we have a button on the right that reads John, which is also the name of the logged in user. So at this point, your app any component in any place of your app could access this state and do what it needs to based on the information that we get from our auth state. And this pretty much shows the power of using Ngrx and how we can scale our components and pages so easily without writing all those ifs and else conditions and without writing all that API code and chaining everything in our component code. We can use our actions, selectors, reducers, and effects, and we can leverage all of that to maintain a very scalable front-end project, more specifically Angular in this case, but this is a general concept of Redux that other frameworks also implement. But that being said, I think this covers what I had for this video. Thank you for sticking around. I hope you were able to follow through, and I hope this helps. Again, if you like my video, if I was able to help you out, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe my channel so as to support me in making more videos. Thank you so much and take care.